Just a few weeks away from primary elections. I mean, early voting is going on, but today we're going to do a little bit of a poll vault thanks to some polling courtesy of one of our insiders, Abdul Shabazz. Brian Gaddy, Democratic insider, also with us. And let's dive right into some of the data that's coming out. And I'm not sure who conducted this poll, but this was in your cheat sheet, which, of course, Abdul will tell you you could subscribe to at indypolitics.org. But let's talk about the downtown district, this newly drawn downtown district. This is District 46 in the state Senate. We talked about this before because last time it came up, we were discussing some alleged internal speak among the Democratic candidates as to whether or not a black Democratic candidate could win that district, which is narrowly majority white. But you've got some polling, or found out some polling, Abdul, showing that not only is the black candidate or a black candidate in the lead right now, it's also not the slated candidate, i.e. the preferred candidate of the Marion County Democratic Party.
Yes, that's what I thought, Ray, was really interesting about the poll that I got my hands on. They surveyed about 300 or so likely voters in Senate District 46. The new district, which is basically, like you said, downtown Indianapolis. And what's interesting is that Ashley Eason was actually quite ahead by about 25, 30%. Now, 35% of the voters were basically undecided, but Kristen Stewart, who was the slated candidate, was like, second or third place. And so for anybody who thinks that the slate's going to do you some good, that may not necessarily be it. Now, granted, we still got a couple weeks to go. Anything can happen. We've got 35% of the voters undecided. So we got to keep that in mind. But I thought that was actually really good news for the Eason campaign.
Now, Brian is someone who is obviously close to a lot of people in the party, including the Marion County Democratic Party. What do you think, depending on what happens on primary day, because you do have a lot of candidates who are not the slated candidates who at the very least appear to be competitive in primaries, not just in the Senate district, but when you look at Marion County Clerk and some of the other races that are on the primary ballot. What do you think this could do, depending on the outcome, to the future of the slating process, which has been a staple in Marion County for a very long time?
Yes, it has. I mean, the slating process has been around longer than we've been around. And as a loyal Marion County Democrat and Indiana Democrat, I'm inclined to want to go with the party and with the slate. But at the same time, the voters choose the politicians ultimately, even though a lot of politicians want to choose the voters. But we have to ultimately go with the will of the people. And if the voters elect to go with a Democrat that's non-slated, then that's the way it is. But I'm inclined as a Democrat to go with the party's choice, the slated candidate.
But here's an interesting question, though. I mean, my question is why? Because some candidates even didn't go through slating. And by the way, slating is the biggest scam that was ever invented. That's part of the reason why judges cannot go through slating anymore now that they're appointed. So we got to think about this. If someone is a good candidate, but they decided not to go through slating because they didn't want to give the party, 10% of their salary to pay the quote unquote slating fee. I mean, come on, let's be serious, Brian. You're a smarter guy than that. You know it.
Well, I'm a smart guy, but I'm also a loyal guy. I'm a loyal Democrat. So I'm inclined to go with what the Marion County Democratic Party or the Indiana Democratic Party, the candidates they choose. And the slated candidate is normally the candidate I'm going to go with. But if that candidate loses to an unslated candidate or non-slated candidate, then of course I'm going to back that candidate if they're a Democrat. But I'm inclined to go with what the party's choice is.
Well, I think and one issue that's causing issues here potentially is one of those slated candidates is the chair of the Marion County Democratic Party this year. So I mean, if that slated candidate loses, I mean, Kate Sweeney Bell's still going to be the party chair. What could that cause? And we're in a bunch of hypotheticals, I know here, but what could that cause when it comes to party unity going into the general election this fall?
Well, that's one of those. Who knows? I mean, I'm hoping that we don't have to face that. I'm hoping that whether it's the slated candidate that wins or the non-slated candidate that wins, that we all as Marion County Democrats come together with a unified ticket to defeat the Republicans.
I think the race, Abdul, for Republicans, at least the big one on their radar, Marion County, I'm thinking is still the prosecutor's race, because they do have a big target on Ryan Mears, and they have in Cindy Carrasco someone they believe can win even in a heavily Democratic county, given all the dynamics when it comes to crime that's taking place, and what have you. Will this, the potential fallout from whatever happens on primary day with the slated versus non-slated candidates, how does that reverberate, do you think, into the prosecutor's race?
I think what it does is, because you're right, Cindy Caruso she's a strong candidate. She raised more than $200,000 in just 3 months. 60% of those were all like under $300 and some change, which tells me that there's some energy and some momentum behind her. Now, granted, Ryan Mears is also raising money as well. Although his reports weren't out as we recorded this program on Friday morning. However, with that said, this is still a Democratic county, so we got to acknowledge that. And so I think Cindy Caruso has maybe a little bit of a less of a tougher hill to climb because of all the dynamics that have been taking place in Marin County over the past couple of years. Now, with that said, though, I think at the much bigger, broader picture rate of your question is whether it's slated or unslated candidates. I think there are some major divides in the Marin County Democratic Party right now, which I would argue actually bodes well for Republicans, I would say, next year. Because if you take your memory, go back to 2011, how did Greg Ballard win the mayor's race? He pulled off a certain percentage of the African-American vote because folks weren't happy necessarily with Melina Kennedy and her mayoral candidacy. And so if Republicans are smart, they'll find a candidate who run for mayor next year who can appeal to minority voters, people of color, whatever the phraseology you want to use. Because I do think there's a lot of dissent up there because people are tired of the Marin County Democrats.
Speaking of Republicans, I know you're shaking your head, Brian. We'll talk about Republicans here and their own primary fight that Abdul highlighted in his cheat sheet newsletter, and that is in Senate District 32, just a little bit north of Indianapolis. Abdul, you sent me the wording of this question, and we may have to just graphically show this on screen for me to aptly describe it. But political people are familiar with the term push polls, where you get a call or get a survey that's nominally an unbiased poll as to how you feel about something. But in this case, the candidates were all, or the questions rather, were all about one candidate, or at least the last few questions were specifically about one candidate in this race, designed to get a specific answer.
Yes, it was the candidate was Fred Glenn, who ran for mayor in Carmel back in, I want to say 2019, who lost to Jim Brainerd. And so there's some questions to who was funding the poll, who put it out, et cetera, et cetera. But what I thought was interesting, and you're right, it was a push poll because at the beginning they asked you normal questions. Are you Republican? How old are you? The typical demographic stuff. And in the end, it's like, let me ask you some questions to make you more or less likely to vote for Fred Glenn. Did you know Fred Glenn does like police officers or firefighters? Like, what in the world? It was like, wow, so much for foreplay, guys. Come on. And so I thought it was interesting that that's out there in House District 32, which is a new district that was drawn in the Carmel area because you got Fred Glenn, Susan Jaworski, and another gentleman in that race as well. But the Jaworski people basically, they reached out to me and said, "Abdul, that wasn't us. We're not doing it." And so it makes me think that it might have been someone associated with current mayor Jim Brainerd, who is not a Fred Glenn fan.
Now, that was a particularly nasty race. But the way this district is drawn, Brian, even though we know that Democrats have made progress in Hamilton County in recent years, I'm not sure if this district, again, since Republicans were in charge of drawing the districts, this would still seem to be a lean Republican district. However, Democrats, I would imagine, would look to take advantage of any disarray there that might come out of that primary process.
Absolutely. Republicans fighting each other is an opportunity for Democrats. And we're beginning to make, as you said yourself, Ray, we're making strides in Hamilton County. Hamilton County is not the solid red, ruby red county it used to be. It's more like a lighter shade red. And Democrats, we have a chance in that county. And we're beginning to make progress in Hamilton County. I say give us about 3 to 5, maybe 3 to 5 years, and you're going to start seeing Democrats winning races in Hamilton County. So we're definitely making progress in that county, no doubt about it.
Well, I know that Mike Schmuel, who's the head of the Democratic Party in Indiana, he gave an interview this week, and he's talked a lot ever since he took over about what the long process, and it will be a long process, given how deeply in the hole when it comes to a minority of state lawmakers and overall elected officials in Indiana, how big a hole Democrats are in. That's going to take quite a bit of time to overcome, but he seems very confident, Brian, that Democrats will ultimately be able to do it. I guess the question is how much patience, if you are a Democrat or someone who may not be inclined to vote with Republicans, maybe independent, how long you're going to have to wait for that?
Chairman Schmoe is doing a great job. I think he's the best chairman we've had over our party. And my goodness, in the last 10 to 15 years, he's without a doubt the best chairman we've had. I know some past chairmen may not want to hear me say this, but Mike Schmoe is the best chairman our party's had in a very long time. And he's doing the necessary groundwork to rebuild our party, to make our party more competitive, not just at the local level, the county level, and the state level, of course. He's working with our county parties, and he's doing a great job. I can't tell you how proud I am as a Hoosier Democrat that Mike Schmoe is our chairman. So I just think people just need to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. We didn't get into this hole overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. But I say give us about 5 to 8 years, or heck, maybe even sooner than that. And you're going to start seeing us winning in places you would never imagine a Hoosier Democrat winning here in this state. And I think we're going to start becoming very, very competitive statewide. So Mike's doing a great job. Keep up the great work, Mike.
Abdul, Democrats have made some, at least they've tried to make them high-profile stops, visits to traditionally really red areas, or at least what have the last decade or so have been super red areas of Indiana. My question is, do stops like that, when you highlight them in the media, you have these planned events, and I don't know who's showing up at those events, whether those are attracting a lot of regular voters, how much impact does something like that truly have? Or is that something, again, that Democrats are playing the extreme long game, if you will, in Indiana?
Well, Democrats are smart in the sense that you got to show up to play. I mean, it's just that simple. And you can't necessarily write off any part of the state. I go back to my home state of Illinois and the Chicago, the Cook County area, and the suburban collar counties, which used to be very heavily reliable Republican. But over time, as people moved and Democrats got their act together, they changed. And now they're a lot more Democrat than they used to be. I think the same thing is possible here in Indiana, provided that Democrats run candidates that fit the district. It's basically the old Howard Dean approach back in 2006. He ran candidates that fit those congressional districts. It was a congressional district with a strongly Second Amendment. Hey, we'll find a 2A Democrat, or a district was strongly pro-life. They find a pro-life Democrat. They found candidates who fit the area. So that this AOC, Ilhan Omar, running in Goshen or Paola, Indiana, is not going to work. Those candidates aren't going to perform well in those areas, but more conservative Democrats actually will. Now, once again, the problem for Democrats is going to be it's a midterm election. Number two, you got the national climate, which the winds tend to still favor Republicans, even though I still think Democrats have an opening to get back and actually still keep control of Congress. But one thing I will give Mike Schmuel credit: if you don't show up, you can't compete, and Democrats are showing up. Luckily, Republicans aren't taking them for granted.
Moving on to looking at the more distant future. Okay, not necessarily that distant a future. We'll talk about next year's legislative session, potentially. This is a story that WRTV did this past week, in which we were shown an email that State Senator J.D. Ford, Democrat, received. And we're going to assume that other lawmakers have received this similar email, looked like a form email, essentially calling for the Indiana legislature to pass what colloquially has become known as a Don't Say Gay bill, or in some states, a Don't Say Gay law, Florida in particular, meaning that teachers at certain levels should not talk about sexual orientation and gender identity in the classroom. Senator Ford, of course, was the first openly gay state lawmaker in Indiana, elected in Indiana. And Brian, it's kind of ironic that he would get this email calling for a Don't Say Gay bill here in this state.
Well, Senator Ford is a great friend of mine, and he's a great legislator. And it's just unfortunate that the Republican Party still has to lean into bigotry in order to gin up their base. Indiana is not a state for hate. We're not going to pass any law like Florida did down there with the Don't Say Gay bill, which I think is ridiculous. We Hoosiers will not tolerate that here. And I just really believe that Republicans need to stop engaging in hate politics. I mean, I don't know why they have to do that in order to try to win elections. Try to speak to issues that affect Hoosiers, the kitchen table issues. And they just love these culture war issues because they really believe that's how they can divide Hoosiers in order to win elections. It's just really a very sad, pathetic way to engage in politics, but that's just the way the Republicans do business, and it's unfortunate.
However, Abdul, next year is not an election year. So would that make it easier, do you think, for Republicans to pass something like this?
I think so, but at the end of the day, we also got to keep in mind too that the Florida legislation, which is the quote unquote "Don't Say Gay" bill, which basically says you can't teach sexual orientation, gender identity from like K through third grade. There is actually logic and rationale behind that, because I don't know if I want my 8-year-old being taught about sexual orientation and gender identity. That's my job as a parent. Now, with that said, though, with so much stuff that kids are exposed to these days, unfortunately, you have to start teach them younger and younger about things like this. And if parents did their job at home, then we wouldn't have to have this necessary issue be done in the school level. Now, with that said, I will suspect that there will be some similar legislation put up in next year's session, but I'm also hearing that a lot of these sort of divisive cultural issues are going to go to rules committee and just go politely go there to die while lawmakers deal with budgetary issues, tax cuts, and taking Indiana to the next level economically.
I think the question, though, with legislation like this is how far does it go? How open-ended is it? I mean, let's say, now hypothetical here, you're a second grade teacher and you mentioned that Pete Buttigieg, Hoosier, Secretary of Transportation, has a husband. Is that teaching about sexual orientation? And if you simply bring up the fact that he's gay, he's in a same-sex marriage, I mean, how far does this go? And how far can you go in telling teachers simply, well, we can't talk about Pete Buttigieg anymore?
No, I think you bring up an interesting point, which is why, like I said, I prefer that this be done by parents at home as opposed to schools. But unfortunately, parents are derelict in their duties as parents, and schools, unfortunately, have to pick up the ball and run with it. And those are some questions that, if this legislation does go forward, I think those are some questions the lawmakers are going to have to ask, which is, okay, are we talking about the biological functions of sex, or we're just talking about just sort of general cultural issues? So, no, I think where you bring up an excellent point on if this does go forward, how will the sex be taught in schools?
And another point, and some criticism that some Democratic leaders have received this week, Brian, and we'll close on this since we've only got a couple minutes left, and that is some in the LGBTQ plus community have accused Democrats of not pushing back hard enough on this issue. Specifically, anytime someone speaks up against the Florida law or whatever, they are referred to by critics as quote unquote groomers, which they are not, but that's what they're called. And Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, one of the Democrats in leadership of the House, made a comment this week that they are essentially trying to ignore stuff like this and focus on, as you alluded to earlier, those kitchen table issues, quote unquote, that voters supposedly care about. Should Democrats be pushing back harder against the notion that you are a quote unquote groomer if you oppose Don't Say Gay legislation?
Well, we Democrats can walk and chew gum at the same time. We don't have to just be talking about the kitchen table issues only. We can also fight against this hate legislation that the Republicans are pushing all over the country. And we can do both. And before we were offline talking about why I'm a Democrat. The three-legged stool why I'm a Democrat is I'm pro-union, I'm pro-civil rights, and I'm pro-environment. And that's everything that makes me a Democrat. So Republicans, I'm a lost cause. You won't be able to change me. But the point I'm making here is that is why we are Democrats. So we can talk about the kitchen table issues, how to put more money in the pockets of Hoosiers and helping them pay their bills, paying gas prices and all that, all that stuff that Hoosiers are grappling with on a daily basis. But at the same time, we must stand against the Republicans and their politics of hate and division. We must always stand against that. If we don't do that, we're not being true to who we are in essence of being a Democrat. And I'm proud to be a Democrat.
Now, if that's Brian's three-legged stool, what is Abdul's? Would that be bacon, cigars, and
the scotch? Yeah.
Abdul, Brian, always a pleasure to have you, our WRTV political insiders. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Hey, Ray, you have yourself a good Easter weekend and happy anniversary, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Happy Easter, everybody.
Hey, come on now. Said it last week, this show is rated PG. As you can probably tell by the blue content there, today is the day of the green, St. Patrick's Day. You could spend it quietly with the great Michal O'Meara Hartig making you the perfect sandwich.
Píosa eile an sin, agus píosa eile an daobh sin.
Or you could do as WRTV legend Reed Duffy did 41 years ago and spend a loud, somewhat debaucherous religious holiday with the great Gordon Pipers. So loud, our old videotape machines had to shake out the cobwebs, apparently, and they hadn't even had anything to drink yet. The Gordon Pipers had a full day of, activities every St. Patrick's Day, all because of their founder, a Canadian veterinarian turned Hoosier.
The Gordon Pipers have been an essential part of St. Patrick's Day in this city since 1962, when Dr. Wallace Gordon Deal founded this windy organization. Before the celebration ends, they'll have found their way to 15 watering holes throughout the city, luring till about 3 in the morning. They tuned up at the brand new Union Jack and Speedway, where they'll wind up about midnight, no doubt in peak condition and feeling no pain. Such is the lure of the bagpipe, one of mankind's oldest, most traditional instruments, especially in Scotland, where most are made and tenaciously cherished, as Dr. Deal found out one day in 1954, when his wife sought to purchase a used bagpipe from a Scottish dealer in his native Canada.
So she goes into the store, and an old Scotsman comes out, and he says, "Can I help you, lassie?" And she says, "Well, yes, I'm kind of looking for a used set of bagpipes." What? He says, "There's no such thing as a used set of bagpipes." He says, "They're a personal matter." And he had her in tears. So he told her, "Well, you got to buy a practice chanter and a book and learn. And when you can play 5 tunes on that practice chanter, we'll think about selling you a set of bagpipes."
Thankfully, Dr. Deal learned his 5 songs, got his precious pipes, and got others to join along with him. And just like the mayor doing goofy waves and dances and this dude in the wig and the kilt, really, man? Really? The Gordon Pipers, to this day, remain a cherished Indianapolis tradition. So Sheena Gabe with Throwback Thursday, Ray Steele, WRTV.